All right.
Okay, so let's see if I can start this show. My name is Renee Hobbs. This is EDC 534. Today's date is April 7th, and we are steaming to the end of the semester with the amazing students of EDC 534. These are all folks who are getting their graduate certificate in digital literacy. I see Tracy, I see Clarissa, I see Kate, I see Max, and some of you are joining us by watching the recording, which I hopefully will save properly this week. Okay, so first things first. What's up with your experience with hit record or hit record? I'm not sure about how you pronounce that. So you had a really and truly creative, very open Leap 4. And I'm kind of curious how it went for you. Who wants to go first?
I'll start off. I enjoyed I could have gotten lost in that website for ages, and I still probably will at different points in time. But I just enjoyed so many of the different avenues that you could go into. Like, I really love writing. I don't get a chance to do it for myself as often as I can. Obviously, like with my work, you get to do editing and that kind of like filmmaking work. So I felt like there was a lot there for the Creative Junkie, and it just seemed like a really welcoming spot if you're willing to just kind of put your stuff out there. And so I thought it was really an excellent place to either find yourself or promote yourself or whatever it is as far as that goes.
Thanks for kicking us off. I like this idea of your perception of it as a welcoming community. That's interesting. I had that experience as well. Clarissa, what was your experience with Leap 4? Kate, what was your experience with Leap 4?
I tried something. My instinct was to hit the writing tab, but I didn't. I have been sitting in on a photography class just for fun, and so I decided to play around with it's like the weekly, I can't remember her name right now, but it's the weekly photography challenge, and they kind of give you an assignment. It's like week 47. So I stopped myself because I was about to cheat because I had something that I thought qualified, but you have to shoot it fresh. And you can only add one thing a week. But what I liked about it was that it created a community of, one, I could learn from people who were already much better photographers than I am. And as a very, very, very amateur photographer, I could participate at the same level and get creative ideas about, because it's like, the assignments are so open to interpretation. And it could be something that you need to go several miles away to shoot, or you could shoot it at your desk. But it's really a way for an amateur photographer to develop an eye, which I do not yet have. But I thought it was, I think the Creative Junkie could definitely stay there forever.
Cool. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for describing a little bit about your experience. Kate, what was your experience at Hit Record?
Well, first off, I had some technical difficulties with it, at least getting started up, and that was a frustration. I tried. The issue was that it only seems to work in Google Chrome. I don't know if anyone else uses a different browser. But my personal netbook at home is only set up with the memory capacity for one browser, and my preference is usually Firefox. I couldn't do it through that. I tried going through an iPad, and it kept recognizing me as a robot. So I had to go and get my work computer, which has better software and everything on it, to actually get access, and then try to find time to engage with it. So I didn't have a chance to really dive into any remixing, and I don't know if there was additional software that may or may not have needed to be involved. But there definitely seems to be a hierarchy of the tasks as well, because I tried to dive into some photography assignments just by where they ask that you take a certain type of photo of architecture or sunset, and I contribute those. But I really didn't see where they went after that.
Right.
So I don't know if that's more of a long-term thing where it's maybe somebody finally picks it up, or if you're just doing those open calls for things where they go.
Yeah, it's a good point that there's definitely like a set of hierarchical things that are some that are connected to challenges or projects, some that are really on fast track, and some that seem timeless or certainly not time bound. And then it's easy for your stuff to disappear. I found once I uploaded a photograph and within seconds it was pushed down by new stuff, right? I mean, essentially it's such a big community that your stuff is challenging to find. I think unless you invest a lot of effort in an identity there.
What was cool was that the person who runs the one that I spent the most time on, she does a weekly kind of like talk show about the top 3.
Oh.
So she celebrates, she, shows, and talks about how they fit the best fit the qualifications. And then there are 3 rules to be in this community. So you kind of get celebrated right next to someone who's been, a lot more polished and experienced. And it's really, it was fun.
Wow. Thanks for describing that way of engaging, that way that the moderators are engaging the community. Tracy, you had an experience with your son. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Went in, I believe, in a different way because I did not answer a challenge on the challenge page. I just went into the explore page and just found something that I thought was cool. And they had at the top of the explore page something that they were pushing that they needed work for. And it was a very specific call out for students that were the age of for films from people that were the age of my children. So I snatched onto it and got onto the explore page. And when I was on the explore page, I found Clarissa kind of like what you were talking about, little videos about here's what you should do, blah, 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 blah. But hers weren't rewarding stuff that was already done. She was explaining what part of the production that she's already completed and where they are and what they were thinking about doing with the stuff. So, Kate, while I don't know where it's going to end up, I have some idea at least what their goal was. And they had this concept of monsters, these morning monsters, and they called out to a bunch of illustrators to say, hey, and they had some beautiful illustrations back. The illustrations were so good that then they put out a call out for poetry so that they could add a poem to each illustration and maybe make a children's book. That was sort of this whole venue that came out of this Morning Monsters idea. Then they had a bunch of people put in voiceover recordings of reading the poems. And then they decided that maybe they were going to animate part of these. They started getting in scripts that they could then animate. And then they put out a call. They've been working to animate a bunch of these scripts, but the call that I answered or where I came in was they were looking for a collection of children or people with something going wrong in the morning that don't have any morning monsters in it, but they were going to take the illustrations and then put those into the video afterwards. So we recorded a picture. One of the things that we recorded was my daughter having her towel stolen while she's in a shower. And the other one that we recorded was my son getting his slipper stolen as he's getting out of bed in the morning. So we just, like moved the slipper and somebody will put the monster in later.
Wow. Cool. So you actually got a lot of understanding of the way in which this multimodal approach to creative collaboration really goes. I am really glad that you guys had a chance to explore Hit Record. I learned about it a few years ago when they were coming to the media literacy community and talking about their work. But since I started poking around it in Hit Record, I've been really thinking a lot more about the teaching practices of artists, and really trying to figure out, where is the overlap between the instructional practices of teaching artists and digital literacy. And so I just want to share with you, I don't know if this is going to work. Is this going to work if I start from this current slide? you can see that. Who's just joined us here? I'm going to look here on the thing and see. I see Zoe has joined us. Hi, Zoe.
Hi.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. So I want to, hold on here. I want to, here we go. I want to do a little, what happened now? Can I see you? I don't know if I can see you. I goofed it up again, didn't I? Let me try to share my screen one more time. I'm not that easy. Okay, there we go. I want to share with you briefly a really interesting report that I read this week that made me think about your hit record leap 4, made me think about where we started this course at the beginning of the semester, and just some thoughts I had in reading this report. This is an unpublished report that was published in 2012 by a group of researchers at the University of Nottingham, the most well-known of whom is the final author, Julian Sefton Green. He's a colleague of David Buckingham. And what this report was a kind of summary produced for the British government about the way in which teaching artists teach. And I thought that was really fascinating because I don't think we know very much about how teaching artists teach. So they didn't describe their methodology all that well. So it's not a great study. And that's partly why I didn't assign you guys to read it. But it is got some interesting ideas in it. What they did was they developed this analytic framework for like paying attention to some things you might pay attention to about what teachers do, right? The introductory activities, the resources that artists provide or create, the classroom discourse that occurs, like the questions and the responses and the feedback and the stories, the flow of the use of time, rhythm, transitions, sequence, and so forth, the use of space, the behavior management issues in terms of where power and authority lies, teaching methods, and framing, right, in terms of how activities are positioned. And I thought that was a pretty interesting analytic framework for thinking about the different ways in which artists and artistic activities may come into a classroom or a learning environment in or out of school where digital literacy may occur. And one thing they did pretty early on in the report was they talked a little bit about the way in which when a teaching artist enters the space, it becomes kind of a third space, right? And that issues of inclusion, a commitment to choice, a willingness, I love that line, a willingness to confront the challenges of scale and ambition, right? I love that line. That's exactly what happens when a teaching artist comes into a classroom. A readiness to use and sanction the absurd and carnivalesque, and a focus on the lived experience in the present. So they identified these as kind of underpinnings of practice that they found across all of the artists that they worked with. But I especially want to showcase 5 or 6 instructional practices that are outlined in the report that I think are intriguing for our thinking about the concept of digital authorship now as we're nearing the end of the semester. The first concept, provocation, is a really interesting one, and we've been kind of exploring this idea as an instructional practice a lot. An object or image or sound or person or event that's deliberately ambiguous, unexpected, and that doesn't have a predetermined meaning, right? In fact, it's the lack of predetermined interpretation that becomes the trigger for meaning making. And so I think about the ways in which provocations are really powerful for inspiring digital authorship. Another instructional practice that the report outlines is the idea of focusing on the porous boundaries between school and home, and a willingness or readiness to translate and reimagine for the familiar texts into new stuff. Like Henry Jenkins, the British report identifies this focus on play, including silliness, eccentricity, and larger-than-lifeness. And I love this idea that the instructional practices of teaching artists focuses on open-ended challenges where learning outcomes are not predetermined. And what is learned is like a trajectory or a journey, but it's not chosen by the teacher in advance. And the teacher doesn't actually maybe even know where this journey will lead. In that sense, the focus is on the intrinsic motivation of the learner and on the student's development of discrimination and judgment. This question of creating genuinely open-ended challenges where the teacher doesn't have a predetermined destination was a topic we talked a lot about when I was in Brussels, and really has to do with a very unique approach to pedagogy that I think we have been embracing in this class this semester. I was really intrigued by the report's framing of the instructional practice of teaching artists being the self as a teaching resource, where teaching artists do engage in open talk about personal life, with this idea, this expectation that of course students are interested in the identity of the teaching artist. And part of self as a teaching resource is the use of your body to make meaning and your use of narrative and performance-oriented activity. So I'm really intrigued about that idea about self as a teaching resource, especially in relation to our digital identities online. And clearly, instructional practices that teaching artists use are professional norms and routines, right? Teamwork and ensemble sensibility. From the current slide. From the current slide. Let's just not go too soon. There we go. So this idea that there are some focus on direct instruction, especially around the traditions in fine arts, right? The fine art traditions for direct instruction. And the last sentence there I think is especially cool. This idea that rhythm and flow of class time is highlighted rather than speed or smoothness of transitions, right? So that brings us back to the idea, Kate, that you identified early on in the course around the Csikszentmihalyi concept of flow and how it affects the creative process. So I wanted to share that little bit of synthesis with you, because in some ways, you're doing Leap 4 is an invitation to think about what could be the instructional practices that cultivate creative digital authorship. And you are experiencing that yourself as learners, but obviously I'm hoping you're thinking about that quite a lot as educators as well. Has any of you guys ever had an experience of working with a teaching artist? Max, I think you are a teaching artist. And Tracy, I think you are a teaching artist. Kate, I think you might be a teaching artist. And Clarissa, I think you might be a teaching artist. Do you guys, and Zoe, you're an artist. And so I think you might be a teaching artist. Do you guys identify with that concept of teaching artist? And do any of those instructional practices that I just described resonate with your experience as a teaching artist?
I can jump in, because that idea of starting from a place of ambiguity is that's one I play with constantly with ELA. Although I find that lots of times it's very overwhelming for students. I just don't know what you want, miss. Like, they want to have an exact understanding of put this on the paper and this is the answer to the question. I can't remember his name, but one of my favorites is this guy. I don't know if can you see this? Can we see that at all?
Yeah, he's holding a chair over his head.
Yes, he's an illustrator. Harris Burdick is his name. And he makes weird, ambiguous pictures that are intended to be just put up and you make up a story that tells me what's happening here. What is it under the rug? You know, what's going, and it's a really good way to start that flow because it doesn't leave you with a blank piece of paper, which is really sometimes intimidating.
Cool. So this issue of ambiguity is something you embrace in your own teaching and use stimulus like that illustration you just described to provoke that. Are there reflections on your identity as a teaching artist?
I guess for me, this semester, I'm trying to incorporate as much as I can, you know, with my own practice. Seems like Tracy's doing the same thing as well. I'm really putting the brakes on my personal, like, very teachery side and putting a lot more onto my students because, you know, I have felt some pushback on some of the things that have traditionally just like, this is how things go in the class. And how we start creating. And I'm starting to see a lot more response from that and guidance being taken on. And there's times, you know, where I'll just have students aiding students in whatever project that they're working on. And it's really good because I can step back and get a much better picture of where this is going. And that can prepare me for that next slightly ambiguous moment just based upon how they're interacting with each other and how they're interacting with the materials and the idea and the flow of what's going on.
That's cool. So in a way, you are renegotiating a role from one that was really familiar to you and to one that is now a different role, a different way of creating a learning environment. Thanks for sharing. Cool. Clarissa, how do you identify as a teaching artist?
Well, until you called me one, I didn't see myself that way. So, but I was thinking about the self as a resource side. I'm very curious about it because I think it's the opposite of what I do. I didn't even think about that before the slide, you know, and I think I remove myself as much as possible and I highlight or amplify the students as resources. But I don't think I use myself, maybe not enough as a resource after hearing that explanation. The other thing I thought about when Tracy was talking was like the experience with students' resistance and all the things you have to unteach when they're like, well, just tell me what you want, you know. But then you're sandwiched between that part of the student and that part of the department that says these are the learning goals. So the journey is not open-ended, but we have a very specific place where you should park your car when you finish. So you're sandwiched between those two. So I was thinking about how awesome it would be to just have this journey and we just discover what we're going to learn, you know, from one leg of the journey to the other. But,
very nice positioning of the reframing around the context, the institutional contexts that do shape and control our work. Yeah, very interesting. Kate, do you identify as a teaching artist, and in what way do you see the instructional practices of teaching artists as relevant to your work?
Well, I didn't really think of myself as one either. Maybe an emerging one at most, but I can definitely relate to what both Clarissa and Tracy were saying, especially when working with American students, there's this inherent sense of play that they just love the opportunity for creativity to show, but when working overseas, it's a completely different context where you're, again, dealing with a different cultural standard, different things that they've either been taught or haven't been taught, very limited resources, so you have to have a certain level of creativity and ability to rely on yourself to just try to meet that need in the middle when you can't print out prompts and things like that.
Great point. So that idea of adapting your identity position in relation to the cultural context and cultural needs, that's a really great point. Zoe, do you identify as a teaching artist, and which of the instructional practices or how do you identify with the concept of a teaching artist in terms of those instructional practices that cultivate creativity?
Me myself, I don't really identify myself as teaching artist because I don't really have that kind of teaching experience. But I don't even identify myself as an artist. To my humble opinion. But I do have many artistic experiences, both in a Western kind of style and kind of Eastern kind of style. In terms of the ambiguity, I think it's very Western style kind of pedagogy in terms of teaching artists. It kind of starts from very original kind of concept and to throughout a piece of segment, and that's where a lot of people can connect their own cultural experiences or personal experiences and create something new. But Eastern style, from what I have experienced, are more likely to lay out the principles first, and then like more slowly and gradually to absorb from the base, and then grow from there.
Yeah, so that is a really, you're really pulling the thread that Kate started around thinking about culture. And in the report, it makes that point that there is a robust tradition of direct instruction in arts training that is really an important tradition.
And another point, I think that maybe from a kind of, I don't know, media production or artist point of view, that you have to think about your audiences. You have to think about your students. Some students work well with ambiguity. Some students don't. So I think that you have really to kind of see what your student needs and what works for them.
Yeah, great point. Well, you can probably guess by now why I wanted to start our conversation tonight, our theme of messy engagement, by talking about teaching artists and the instructional practices they use, because the topic of messy engagement is complicated. And so here's what I thought we could do for about maybe 8 minutes or so, just about 8 minutes. So I got a chance to take a look at your Flipgrid responses and your posts on the Moot discussion board. It's really clear that you did dig into those readings and tried to sort through the challenges that can happen with digital authorship. So I thought it would be cool for us to work with a dyad partner on maybe one or at the most 2 of these questions. So as I read these questions out loud, I'd like you to think about which one of these you'd like to focus your discussion with a partner on. Okay, so the first question, do students really want to be active learners? Why or why not? Is it a good idea to call popular culture a type of pedagogy? Why or why not? What makes comedy a particularly challenging form? What makes student-created parody a particularly challenging form? How, why, and when does ridicule become a form of discrimination and abuse? When student digital authorship reinforces stereotypes and inequalities, how should teachers react? What's fun about transgressing boundaries of political correctness? What should be the limits of student empowerment or transgression? What kind of transgression and messy engagement do you want to see in your classroom? What kind would you prefer to avoid? Okay, those are all cool questions, right? But now it's time for you to chat chat with your partner. So basically what I'm going to do is, let's see here. There's only 5 of us, so let's just form 3 small groups. We're going to just take about 7 minutes. Choose 1 or 2 of those questions to chat about, and then we'll report out when we're done, all right? Oh, okay. So I think everybody's back but me. I don't know how that happened, but so we've just been away for about 8 minutes reflecting on a couple of the questions from really generating from the readings about transgression and messy engagement. Why don't we just go around the room and everybody share, you know, something meaningful that came out of that discussion for you? Who wants to go first?
I'll start, I guess. Or Zoe was about to start. So Tracy and I ended up talking about a couple different things, touching upon different questions. Most of the conversation was really led by her own examples of how she incorporates parody into her classroom, which was interesting. We talked about how when it could work, when it doesn't work. She teaches with the upper age levels, so she has this lesson plan that's structured by genre and has it really framed for them, and they seem to be engaged by that, as opposed to when I'm talking about my own experience not using parody, because when I've worked with younger students, it's kind of a more advanced concept for them, and then overseas, certain cultures don't have the same gauge on satire, and that's its own thing to overcome. But we also talked about the first question and whether students really want to be active learners or not. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of yes and no at the same time. Because Tracy indicated her first response is no, but maybe sometimes, whereas mine is more yes, but I can see no as well. So, I mean, she might want to elaborate on it more, but it's just the fact that I think when you are able to get content engaged with a learner, they will latch onto that. But it's the matter of the fact that so many young people are either burnt out or worried about doing well and overachieving, that you have to really break down that framework before you can get them more into the active learning.
Nice. So once you clear away all those barriers, then yes, deep down they are engaged. Nice. Max, what's one big idea that you got out of this little tiny bit of discussion that you had with your partner?
Well, Zoe and I, we talked a little bit about just comedy and parody as well, and the complexities with like audience intent and where you're putting that bounds or those bounds. And with students creating that, there also is a limitation of access to the idea of parody. Like if you've only seen one film of this genre, you're only going to be able to parody elements that you see that, but it's not going to expand beyond there. So how are you actually really incorporating that? Is it going to be comprehensive? And also just like, if you're creating some sort of comedy, how are you finding yourself on that that line, like of being satirical, of challenging and kind of provoking your audience to think deeper, or are you just being offensive and trying to provoke a negative response or negative feeling within the people that you're speaking about?
Ooh, nice. Zoe, you want to extend on that, an idea that was meaningful to you from reflecting on your 7-minute discussion with Max?
Right. I just totally agree with Max. That's what we talked about. And also, I was talking about why it's challenging to create a parody, because to use that form is because you already put a format or a frame or some sort of theme on the students, and it on one hand it kind of limited their creativity of creating something like new, but on the other hand, it might kind of make you more focused on your creative expression on that specific genre. And also we talked about the boundaries and the scales, and you have to be like weighing really precisely that to what point it makes perfect sense, and when you go over it, it's kind of, you know, too much. It's, how much is too much? How much is enough?
Yeah.
So that is very challenging for students.
Yeah, it's challenging for grown-ups and it's challenging for students alike. Tracy, can you capture an idea that was meaningful to you from the 7-minute discussion that you had?
So yeah, we also talked about parody, lots of talk about parody. But one of the things that I really sort of work with parody is very much from the consumption point of view instead of the production point of view. So you've got a lot more messiness when you're dealing with the production point of view, because you don't know where the lines are and where you step over those lines and that sort of thing. We sort of talked about that line as being, particularly in a classroom, if you're crossing a line that hurts someone, that's a line that you don't cross. That was sort of our messiness deal with the production.
Nice.
With parody, I usually teach from the consumption aspect, because in a well-done parody, there will be one aspect of whatever is being parodied that changes.
Right.
And so using parody, I find, is a really great tool for teaching whatever that one aspect is. Mm-hmm. So the example that I was talking about with Kate was, I've got Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And then I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it's hilarious. There's a poet named Henry Beard who does everything from the point of view of his cat. And he also does The Raven. So you're doing The Raven from Edgar Allan Poe's point of view and from the point of view of his cat. And you can see the sort of different interpretations of the action in the text.
Right.
It's a great way to teach point of view.
Right.
So as long as you've got like one particular thing that you can really pull out of that parody, I teach from that point of view.
Nice, nice. Thank you so much for sharing, because you're also talking about a little bit of control, right? Control of the form and content. And I love also the way you're framing about as a consumer and as a creator, and how that's that nexus of the critical and the creative. Clarissa, what do we talk about in our little 7 minutes that was meaningful to you?
Yeah, well, we didn't talk about this, but I've been hearing this was really, really nice, and it tied into the Flipgrid to me. This how, and I think Max kind of started it, and then it went to Zoe, and talking about how intertextuality has everything to do with construction of parody. And how if you only have one reference, like she was talking about the raven and the cat, and I never thought about, because I love the way that teacher taught intertextuality, but that has nothing to do with what I'm supposed to be talking about. So we were thinking about the last 3 questions, and I brought up having recently seen The Hateful Eight, Quentin Tarantino's work, and then previously Django, and how a conversation with someone recently was talking about being disturbed about the abuse to the woman, the captive woman, and then previously the way he pushed the line with regard to his he was called flippant for his handling of slavery. And just talking about how do we address these issues with students, the question of the role of art and having them decide what they want art to mean, and proceed from that decision. And then the other thing that we talked about was a student that I have who was writing a paper about how video games have been accused. And it's just like he's bringing it up like it's a fresh argument, right? How certain violent video games are accused for the violence and desensitizing of young people, which we've been through with hard rock, we've been through with rap, NWA, all that stuff, right? So, but for him at 17, this is a fresh argument. And we were talking about that they're challenged with the question of their responsibility or some sort of social responsibility. I think you brought up if someone was hurt, Tracy?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it that's the place of confrontation for them? Like that's where they are put on the defensive for the things that they like to consume in media, right? So I don't know. I think I tried to run through everything that we talked about.
That was pretty good. I thought that was pretty good. And having been in that conversation, I could see how you pulled together the threads of what we talked about. I think, it's complicated to try to put a wrap up on the discussion topics that the messy engagement readings got at, except to say that it comes down to that question number 8, which is, it's really about what your perspective on these topics are and where your comfort zone is, right? And recognizing that digital authorship is going to give creative control to students in ways that are going to shift authority and power relationships and create opportunities for unpredictable things. And so really coming to have your own well-developed understanding of your own limits and your own place of comfort and discomfort is really what the whole point of this week's focus was going to be about. Now I feel pretty awful because it's 8 o'clock and I still have 10 more minutes. And I'm hoping you're going to carry with me on that, even though I'm running a little late because I want to take 10 minutes to share with you how I incorporated you guys in my talk about teaching digital literacy. I got to go to the Eastern Communication Association this past week, and I was on a panel discussion called Revolutionizing Our Approach to Visual Communication. And I decided to use my 10 minutes to talk about you. And I thought, it's only fair if I'm going to talk about you that I should talk about you to you. And I also think the questions that I raise in this talk are kind of questions I'd like to throw back at you and have you help me answer, because you really are in a position to answer these questions. So what I did really was, in a very rapid way, I kind of ran through the theoretical arguments for the way I'm teaching now outside the walled garden in this class in digital authorship, where all your work and all my work is public, except for the assessment and evaluation, and you're keeping an e-portfolio, and you're sharing content on Twitter, and you're creating media as a way to learn through the leaps, and you're writing these multimedia reflective essays, and you're doing an independent project that includes a Screencast Ignite presentation, right? And I have observed the way in which the dialogue in the Flipgrids is a kind of mediated performance, and that over the last 7 or 8 or 9 weeks, you have become increasingly sensitive to the Flipgrid as a mediated performance, and you've actually gotten to a place of having real dialogue in that space of mediated performance. And so I'm fascinated at the way in which your presentation of self has evolved over the course of the Flipgrid. I'm starting to think about this pedagogy as a create to learn pedagogy, so I'm trying out that language and talk a little bit about the tools. I shared a couple of minutes of Kate's marvelous Flipgrid. I shared a couple minutes of Tracy's marvelous Leap. And then I decided to use your visualization activities as a worked example. And here's the way I thought about it. Basically, I observed how each of you solved this problem. This problem was, remember, compare and contrast, doing some kind of visualization. And of course, the tremendous diversity of how you approached the task is of fascinating interest. And the way in which you manipulated a variety of different kinds of symbols, in this case, including color, language, and images. In this case, looking at the explicit use of color for comparison contrast, and the essentially the pull quote, which we've been kind of learning as to find a powerful quote and see how it connects to other quotes. And in this one, which has a really interesting way of using a Venn diagram, in the center of the diagram are what these two works have in common, the themes these two works have in common. I'm going to just make it a little bit bigger so you can see that. And on the edges, this student has put in video examples that illustrate some of the key ideas in the Peter Levine article and in the Halverson article. So really using features of a Venn diagram, but also using features of the searchable web to illustrate and extend the points made in the article. Here, this idea of kind of a flow chart includes another novel feature, which is really identifying key concepts, right, in a very problem solution structure, which is a quite novel way to compare and contrast. And in this one, the thing link, where the image is actually annotated with hyperlink dots, creates another kind of way of representing the two texts by anchoring the ideas of those texts to visual elements, right? And so then some other students solved this problem by using forms, instead of using forms of illustration, by using forms of abstraction, right? So this one abstracted around some themes about the youth media as a producer, as citizen, and as youth media practice as a very foundational practice of democracy. Here's another one that also used abstraction to get at the intersection between art making or media making and the tension between the mass culture pressures for corruption and mismanagement and the democratic impulses toward learning. And here's another that used an infographic model to do a very kind of mano a mano comparison, contrast, right? But also positioning the author in there with the smiley faces and the frowny faces, right? So I found myself using this worked example as a place to generate questions about how digital visualization is learned in the context of this grad class. So I wonder, how does the public nature of the learning experience affect the quality of student work? What is the learning progression in creating visual communication with these easy-to-use digital tools? How do templates support, shape, or restrict creativity? How does the cognitive load of using a new digital tool influence the creative production process? And how does the cognitive load of using a new digital tool affect the acquisition of content knowledge? And finally, does the Create to Learn pedagogy advance students' visual design competencies even when formal instruction in visual composition is not emphasized? So I concluded my talk by wondering about whether and how online learning outside the walled garden can advance visual communication competencies while building content knowledge through the process of creating to learn. So that's my little talk. And in some ways, I invite you in your reflective essays to consider some of those questions as we approach the end of the semester, and you think about the design of this learning experience and you're navigating through it. Okay, so let me just do one other thing before I let you go, which is I want to talk a little bit about what's oh, I don't know I don't know what you can see there. What can you see there? How does that look? Hold on. For whatever reason, that's what it's letting me. That's what it's letting me share. So I'm sharing it. Okay, I think that's probably going to work. So let's take a look at the deadlines that are coming up. Right, I'm going to make my screen a little bit bigger. Whoa. Hold on. Okay. There's 3 deadlines coming up. You guys have just finished Leap 4, and now you're on now the whole month basically, or until May 5th, 4 more weeks until your final project is due. On April 20th, you owe me a reflective essay number 2, right? Remember, you wrote the first one at the beginning of the semester. The second one is due on April 20th, right? Remember, your idea here is you're describing, analyzing, and synthesizing ideas from the readings and the course experience, what you're noticing about yourself as a learner, what you're doing, the kind of Deweyan reflection on action as a blog post, just like you did at the beginning of the semester. I think you're pretty comfortable about the Ignite presentation and the final project, but here's the kind of cool part. We're now at this phase, according to the syllabus, we're now in the work phase for your final project. So we aren't going to have a class or readings or content for the next 2 weeks. For the next 2 weeks, your 100% focus is on your final project, as it should be. So what we're going to do next week in our synchronous class is simply have an open strategy session where you can talk about your work, where we can talk with each other about the work that we're doing, and really just do a kind of check-in. And so there's the expectation that you are full steaming ahead for the next 2 weeks, so that the open topic strategy session in the next 2 weeks is really a check-in, so that I can be helpful to you as you move forward to your final session. And then we will have our final class session on Wednesday, April 27th. So this week I have a very light load of things for you to do, just really one thing. I thought it would be good, in light of our thinking about messy engagement and kind of returning back to this issue of creativity, to take a look at the work of Julian Sefton Green. He gave a speech in Germany. It's broken up into 4 5-minute chunks. It's a 20-minute speech. And it's called The International Creative Learning Landscape. So I'd just like you to watch that talk, part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and then tweet about a concept from that video, or feelings that you got watching that video, or ideas that were meaningful to you. Send at least one tweet. Really, this week you're supposed to be focusing on your project. You are not required, but you are most welcome to schedule an individual consult, either a 30-minute chunk or a 60-minute chunk. I've put up on the, I don't know what this is called, like a scheduling tool. I've put up slots this Friday, next Tuesday, and the following Monday. So feel free, if any of those slots work with you, feel free to sign up. We can talk about your final project, but we can talk about anything. So it's not like, it's got to be about your final project. It's just time for you to have a one-on-one time, if that's meaningful or useful to you now at this stage of the semester. And if one of those times does not work for you, just send me an email and we'll find another time, right? Okay, so that was my extra 10 minutes. Do you guys have any urgent questions or issues before I let you go? Tracy.
Is that presentation you just showed us? We can get to that, right?
Absolutely. So what I did was I put it right here. Hold on, I'm just gonna go back to share my screen. Share my screen. I put it here. It says my talk about teaching digital literacy at the Eastern Communication Association. Right. So there it is. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for asking. What other questions you guys have? Okay. I know you're working hard on your final projects. I am really looking forward to seeing your creative identity by looking at your leaps. And I should have your feedback on Leap 3 done by the end of the week. So God help me. We're just going to try to pull it together and stop watching Netflix. So I'll see you guys next week. All right. Bye-bye.